Hello everyone, this is Sadhana Alangar. Welcome to Fire Dev Days and Leveraging US Specifications. One of the three initial editors of Fire, Lloyd McKenzie, is here to teach this class, to present today. At this time, I'm going to hand over the program to Lloyd. Hi, Lloyd.
Hey, Sadhana. Yeah, this is not a course. You're used to me teaching courses. If you have not yet seen me on chat.fire.org, that's because you're probably not on chat.fire.org and you should get there. I've been involved with Fire since before it was called Fire. I stick my fingers into all sorts of different pieces of it and been involved with standards for 20-ish years. Particularly relevant to this topic is I've been involved in the creation of a whole bunch of Fire implementation guides. And despite the fact that I'm a Canadian, almost all of the IGs that I work on are US specific. And I would like to see some of them leveraged elsewhere. So I figured I would talk about that, and Firely figured it was worth sharing. So what we're going to cover in the next 35 minutes, because there's 10 minutes or so for questions, is we're going to talk about three main terms: the notion of universal, realm-specific, and internationalizable. We're going to talk a little bit about why US standards are as prolific as they are in comparison with the rest of the world. We'll talk a little bit about how to internationalize US standards, whether you are creating a US standard that you would like to be leverageable elsewhere, or whether you're not from the US or you have clients who are not from the US who are potentially interested in leveraging US work. And then we'll talk a little bit about the specific parts of implementation guides and some of the considerations around adapting those implementation guides for international work. And there we go. So some stats. If you go look at the HL7 implementation guide registry, there's 165 guides currently listed, or there were when I last looked a couple of days ago. Of those 80, so just under half are identified as US realm. There's 61 that are identified as being international in scope, i.e. they apply to all countries. And then there's 22 from various other countries, Switzerland and Germany and Canada and various other places. And so that particularly registry is exceptionally US centric and not terribly international centric. There is another broader registry, registry.fire.org, which is maintained by Firely. It has a whole lot more implementation guides in it. It's theoretically supposed to have everything that is in the HL7 registry, but apparently it doesn't, or if it does, they're not all categorized in the same way, because it only lists 65 US implementation guides and only 40 international specifications and 9 with for specific realms, and then a whole lot that are not well categorized at all. So depending on which registry you look in, either US totally dominates or at least US dominates what's categorized. Looking at things from a different perspective, if we look at all of the different accelerator projects that HL7 International has on the go, there's currently 8 of those. There's only one that is really focused on international. All of the others, while they develop content that might be relevant and of interest to other countries, they all have a primary mandate of focusing on US specific initiatives. So short version of this is the US is doing a whole lot of stuff, and the rest of the world kind of wants to be able to take advantage of it, or at least ought to. So why is the US producing so much stuff? Part of it is that Fire came along at a really sweet timing point in terms of where the US was at nationally. The US had made a fairly big push into CDA implementation. but they were sort of well into that process and had been far enough along into it to realize it wasn't necessarily getting them everything that they had hoped that it was going to get them. Perfect timing, Rick. Wanted to wait to diss CDA until you enter the room. That's good too. And FHIR came along just as they were at that point where they were ready for something new. On the other hand, I, as a Canuck, was in a slightly different place where we were just really rolling out a whole bunch of HL7 version 3 stuff, and there was zero appetite at that point for anything new or exciting. And we're probably about 3 or 4 years behind where the US was. So that's one part. The other is that the US has been extremely proactive in regulating adoption of FHIR, and that's through ONC and CMS and others. Obviously, the US is a really huge market, and they spend a great deal, and that tends to influence what people pay attention to and are willing to invest in. HL7 itself is in part to blame. While HL7 is an international standards organization, it is based in the US. Historically, a lot of the meeting times, et cetera, have been US centric. And so the engagement tends to be slightly weighted towards North American participation, but also US participation. And perhaps one of the more important considerations is that developing an international standard takes longer than developing a national standard, because whenever you're developing a standard, you're working to get consensus, and getting consensus across all the countries in the world, or even a significant portion of the countries in the world, takes a long time. It's more work to get all of the people involved and a whole lot more considerations. So when you're wanting to get something up and running quickly and out there and in use, it's a whole lot easier to say, well, yes, the rest of the world cares about this, but we're going to call it US centric because that lets us move fast. And that's the driver behind quite a few of the accelerator projects, is that they want to move fast. So if you've got a US specific standard, why would you want to adopt that elsewhere? And there's a number of reasons. One is that the more we do things the same, the happier implementers are, because there's a lot of implementers that, while they need to implement things in the US, they also need to implement things in Canada and the UK and Japan and Argentina and various other places. Implementers are increasingly international, and even those who aren't sort of like the notion that they might be able to expand into international markets at some point in the future. Second is, if you have a specification that a government or other body has thrown lots of time and money at, hosting connectathons, talking with implementers, testing it out, trying to come up with something that works, both on the implementation side of things and on the people consensus side of things, it's nice to be able to leverage that. I'm perfectly happy for the US taxpayer to invest in Canadian standards. That's a good deal for me. And so if I can leverage work that's already been done elsewhere that I know is implementable because it has been implemented, that is a helpful thing. And of course, there's an awful lot of investment that has happened in these US specific standards because they have so much market force behind them. So let's talk about some terms. These terms did not originate with FHIR. HL7 has used them for a very long time. And sometimes the terms aren't necessarily even great terms, but they're so deeply embedded into HL7's fibers that we can't really change them. So the first of those is the notion of realm. Typically, when you think of the word realm, translate that into country. But in theory, realms don't have to be country specific. We could have a North American realm that covered Canada and the US and Mexico. It's just that we typically aren't organized and don't do things on that basis. You could also have a European realm where all of the countries in Europe could cooperate through the EU or some other mechanism and do things. Although, of course, what's in the EU and what's not in the EU is a changeable thing, and there's challenges there. But a realm is a bounded, typically national, could be a different geographic unit that defines the intended scope for a specification. In FIRE's terms, it's almost always an implementation guide. Universal is a special type of realm that basically says this is intended for use everywhere. We could have said international, but HL7 likes to be broad. And so it's not just on planet Earth. We cover the entire universe with our universal specifications. Yeah. The last term is one that we're just starting to see used, and you won't see a whole lot of places yet, but we're really trying to push towards use of this term, which is internationalizable. And what that is a specification that is created in the scope of a single realm. So US or Italy or Nicaragua or wherever, but it's developed in a way that says, you know what, this is intended to be used in other places too. All the folks that we have at the table, or the vast majority of the folks that we have at the table, are focused on this particular country, and we can't guarantee that this content is going to be leverageable elsewhere, but we think and intend and hope that it will be leverageable elsewhere and want you to come and play and try to use it. And that is something that, awesome. We're trying to encourage implementation guide authors to think about, and we'll be working towards giving them a way of labeling that so that when you see something that is listed as being a specific country, if it also says that it's internationalizable, you'll be able to say, oh, well, yes, this says Italy, but it's related to this particular type of cancer, and I'm interested in that particular type of cancer, and because it's internationalizable, maybe this is actually still a good candidate for me to take advantage of. When you're looking at an implementation guide, there's a whole bunch of different things in it that can tie it to a particular country or realm. Terminology, the codes that are used within that, the types of identifiers that are used, what extensions they have or they don't have, business rules within the implementation guide, and even the individual descriptions and examples. And we're going to take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So in some cases, terminology isn't a barrier at all. If you embed LOINC codes in your implementation guide, for the most part, that's not going to in any way stop it from being adopted anywhere in the world. Now, there are a few countries that have said we don't really like LOINC and we want everybody to use SNOMED for everything. And in those countries, then yes, you may have to add some additional codings to support that regulatory or cultural requirement. But by and large, you're free to use those. Or if the implementation guide has gone off and invented its own codes, as was occasionally necessary. So they've defined an extension and they've defined a set of 4 codes for that extension. That's not a problem. You can leverage that anywhere in the world. There are other places where you're going to see country-specific codes. So in Canada, we have drug identification numbers for drugs. NICTIS has their own set of codes in the Netherlands. In the US, they have RX norm. Again, there are different country-specific SNOMED subsets that are defined in pretty much every country that has a SNOMED license. And those are perhaps less problematic in terms of internationalization because it's really just a question of substitution. If I see RX norm in a US spec, I say, okay, well, in Canada, I need to use CCDD. Netherlands, they know that they have their own particular set of codes that they're going to use. And that's a pretty straightforward substitution. I don't need to do a whole lot of analysis. I might ideally want to have mappings so that I can share instances from Canada or Japan or wherever into these other countries. And if mappings exist, great. But realistically, I'm probably not going to undertake creating mappings for all of the drug codes that exist in a particular country because it's a lot of work and I don't have the money. Where things get more entertaining is when there are tightly licensed terminologies that you can't even really see outside of a particular jurisdiction. And in the US, the obvious one there is CPT codes. I, as a Canadian, can't really go and see any of those codes. And that makes it challenging for me to understand, what does this mean? How do I migrate? And for those, you sort of have to chat with the IG authors or infer what kinds of codes are relevant and see if you can come up with a mapping. So if you are designing an implementation guide that is intended for use in multiple countries, then do your best to avoid leveraging terminologies that are really tightly licensed, because it creates barriers. Even if they're going to need to swap out terminologies, not even knowing what the terms are, makes mapping hard, makes adaptation of other code software harder. So in terms of how do you handle that, substitute in whatever terminology you need to. If you can, send the original terminology as well. So create concept maps that allow you to send both your preferred terminology as well as the international terminology, because that makes it a whole lot easier for existing software to just run with your stuff. In terms of identifiers, you won't necessarily see this in all implementation guides, but some implementation guides will embed expectations. In Canada, provincial health numbers are a big one. In the US, things like provider numbers, or tax numbers, that sort of thing. And you will see these hard baked into profiles where they will slice the identifier element and say, one of these slices is mandatory or must be supported, and here is the system that you must use. And in the case where you're needing to swap to a different country, you're probably not going to have US specific provider numbers that you can send, or US social security number, or whatever identifier it is. And for that matter, the US is probably not going to have an Alberta provincial health number in their systems. And it may be that you just remove that requirement and say, we're pretty open in terms of identifiers, or maybe you will substitute and say, this is the system or set of systems that are relevant for use in our particular country or jurisdiction. So just be on the lookout for those. They're not going to sort of be as obvious as the list of terminologies. There's a nice little table that lists all the terminologies in the implementation guide. There is no equivalent table, at least not yet. If you think it's a really good idea, you can talk to the people who create the IG publication tools, and we could possibly create a table that does that. But for right now, you have to go and look at the profiles to see that this is happening. Extensions are common throughout most profiles, and some extensions are completely country agnostic. There are extensions for things like what is the patient's primary religion, or flagging that a particular name is a middle name as opposed to a first name. There isn't anything terribly country specific about those. But then there are other extensions that are very much country specific. There's an address part extension that lets you say that this is the houseboat across the street from, and we don't use that in Canada, but it's pretty common, or at least possible, in the Netherlands, and important there. And so when you are looking at adopting an implementation guide, you need to take a look at all the extensions that are present and evaluate, is this something that is country specific? Or is this something that is generic that I can leverage? And at the same time, you need to be thinking, are there extra things that I need for use in my jurisdiction that are not here? So in Canada, we sometimes care about First Nation status. That matters to us. It's not tracked in the same way in the US and may not be relevant at all in Great Britain. And so these are things that you need to think about and evaluate as you're looking at leveraging existing profiles. Business rules are miserable. And business rules are miserable because they can show up anywhere. You can have a comment sitting on an element that is 4 levels deep in a profile that you don't even see on the first screen. You have to dig through and read it and go, oh, okay, that there's US specific language in there. They're talking about a US regulation, or they are setting an expectation about default values or whatever. And there's no way to manage that other than doing a very careful read of the implementation guide. We're going to talk a little bit later about what people can do to make this easier. But fundamentally, if you want to leverage an existing implementation guide, you have to go through all of the language of the fine-tooth comb and figure out, is there anything here that is US specific or some other country specific that I need to override or change in some way. And then we have descriptions and examples. And this can actually be an awful lot of work. Examples take a lot of time to create, and sometimes it's not necessarily worth updating them. So if I've got a US specification that I'm wanting to adapt into a Canadian specification, I could go through and change all of the addresses for all of the patients to be British Columbia or Ontario instead of Ohio or Florida. But frankly, I wouldn't bother because nobody in Canada cares. Addresses look the same or close enough that it's not going to be bothersome. On the other hand, if I was trying to do the same thing for Japan, maybe it would be a bigger stretch, and maybe changing those examples would matter more. So you evaluate how much energy it's worth in terms of updating your examples and descriptions. Same sort of thing. Maybe the fact that it's referencing US regulation is not going to be disconcerting to your implementer community. Think about who they are. If they're an implementer community that is used to working with US specifications and ignoring the portions that are not relevant to them, then maybe you don't have to rewrite a whole bunch of that stuff. On the other hand, if they're going to look at it and go, well, that's talking about US stuff, I can't use it, then that's something that you'll need to change, because of course you do not want the language in the specification to be seen as a reason or an excuse, depending on the nature of your implementers, to not leverage what you've got. At minimum, with your examples, you will need to make changes to your examples to reflect all of the changes that you've made to the spec. So if you've removed extensions or added extensions or changed cardinality rules or anything like that, you will have to update your examples so that they are valid against the revised specification. So if you've got an implementation guide, one of the first things that you need to do is figure out, is this something that is even appropriate for me to reuse? So is the use case one that actually suits the country that I'm trying to leverage this into? So if I'm looking at a Codex implementation guide, or I'm looking at a Gravity implementation guide, is this use case something that is consistent with the same needs that exist in Canada? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. There are, for example, DaVinci implementation guides that are absolutely applicable in most countries. And there are DaVinci implementation guides that are very US-centric, that apply to mapping to other US standards and are tightly influenced by US regulations. And the rest of the world doesn't have to do any of that stuff, thank God. And you need to evaluate whether a given implementation guide makes sense or not. The second thing to look at is the architectural choices. Within FHIR, there are so many different ways that we can solve exactly the same problem. We can use REST, we can use bulk data, we can use messaging, we can use custom operations, we can use documents, we can use subscription, we can use polling. And all of these have different trade-offs, but they're also influenced by national choices. So in some cases, you have a very deep infrastructure around document sharing and exchange. And so a document-centric approach is going to work well for you. In other cases, like the US, there's been a strong push to enable RESTful interfaces, and a document-centric architecture may not make a whole lot of sense. If you've got an implementation guide that depends on there being a national provider registry and national location registry, and you don't have one of those, then the implementation guide is probably not going to scale well in your particular environment. So think about what are the architectural assumptions that the implementation guide is bringing into play, and whether those same assumptions hold in the jurisdiction that you're looking at adapting the IG to. And it may be that the assumptions don't hold right now, but we want to bring in all of this stuff. And so we will build those registries, and we will build those terminology services, and we will build those other pieces. That's viable, but it's a whole lot more work than just simply adapting that implementation guide. Think as well about who are your target implementers. Are you going to be targeting the same organizations that have already implemented this? So if I am in Canada and I am targeting Epic and Cerner and Allscripts and other EHR implementers who already have significant US market share and are rolling out these things in the US, then they are going to have a strong interest in doing things consistently in Canada as they are in the US. On the other hand, if I'm targeting sort of general practice EHR systems, there's not a whole lot of overlap between those who implement in the US and those who implement in Canada. And it's perhaps less of a sales pitch to them to say, hey, all of this stuff was already implemented in the US. Their response is going to be, so that's not our market. That's not, we don't have market share down there. And so the fact that we could possibly leverage it there may not be a selling feature. Take a look at whether the business itself is similarly aligned. Is the business model orchestrated similarly? Is it the same types of clinicians who are involved? Is the workflow designed in the same way? We have the notion of drug prescriptions throughout the world, but the way that prescriptions actually happen, who is responsible, how do the prescriptions get handled by the pharmacy, who actually deals with dispensing, does vary somewhat from place to place. Are different types of clinicians allowed to dispense and what they're not can vary somewhat. And so the more closely aligned the business practices are between the country that developed the implementation guide originally and the country that you're looking at adopting it in the future, the easier it's going to be to leverage that. And then finally, is the community itself going to benefit through the sharing? So if I have data that's represented in a particular way consistently in the US and in Canada, does that mean that the data itself is going to flow more easily? And is that going to end up benefiting the patient community or benefiting public health or benefiting the research community? What are the advantages to having this information shared consistently? The more advantages you can find to the consistency, the easier it's going to be to adapt and to convince the community to adapt rather than building anew. In terms of adapting something, there's sort of three main approaches. One is to point to the other implementation guide and say, go do that thing, except these parts. So you don't create an implementation guide from scratch. You basically create a supplemental document that identifies deltas, and every implementer needs to go look at both sets of specifications. The base specification, which is US centric or created in some other country, and then your supplemental document that says, do this, but do make some changes. Possibility two is you take the original implementation guide, clone it in GitHub, and go to town editing whatever it is that you need to do to reflect your particular desired set of changes. That's a lot more work, but it means that from an implementer perspective, I only have to look at one spec and things are nice and clean, neat and tidy. And if the reference specification evolves, that doesn't impact me because I'm locked to whatever version I happen to fork from. Third possibility, and this is not well supported by tooling yet, but is something that we could theoretically do if there was interest. We could define an implementation guide using the patch mechanism, where we say, take this profile, apply these deltas, and that generates a new profile for us. And so if we start getting into a place where adaptation rather than derivation is something that is important, that is a technical capability that FHIR has that we could build into the tooling stack. So not something that we're currently seeing today, but if you think that you're going to be doing a lot of adaptation and you think that this would be useful to you, come talk to the publishing folks and we will see what we can do for you. If you are designing something for international use, first of all, just think about the fact that maybe this is relevant to non-US folks, and keep that in mind as you are designing. Because if you are thinking about this could be relevant for US, non-US folks, then it's a whole lot easier for you to compartmentalize the pieces that are US specific. You can avoid embedding US specific terms in places where you don't need to, and you can perhaps flag the portions of the specification that are US specific. It makes those of us who are following after and trying to leverage your content a whole lot happier if you just put it into specific sections. The other thing that can be done, it's a little bit more work and does produce a little bit more in the way of artifacts, is create your profiles in 2 layers. So create a base profile that includes all the business requirements that are generic and international. So this is how you represent a registry entry regardless of what country you're in. And now here is the US specific provider registry entry that adds on those 2 identifiers that are US specific. The rest of it is generic. And that makes it much easier for international folks to just leverage that high level profile and then tighten it down in their particular country. And you get a whole lot more sharing that way. That does require, however, more investment and therefore is only going to happen if there is a commitment to international use downstream. A few other things to think about. If you are borrowing from somebody else's work, how best do you declare that? It is certainly useful to indicate that there is alignment, but also to flag where there is non-alignment. So where are you diverging so that somebody who is looking at, well, I need to implement the Canadian spec, but I also need to implement the US spec, they have a sense of where are they going to run into challenges and differences. But you also need to think about how are you going to maintain that alignment. So US core evolves every single year because Brett just likes to do that. And most other international specifications do exactly the same thing. And so if you're going to leverage something, is it a one-off where I'm going to grab version 3.0 and create my international or my Canadian specification off of that and then I'm done? Or I will, after that, fork and I'm going to do my thing and the US will continue to do its thing. If you fork and diverge, you're not going to get the same benefit long-term from an implementer perspective, but it's more work if you need to continuously integrate changes and try to align as the US specification evolves and your own requirements evolve. If you are creating a specification and initially creating it as country specific, you need to think about at what point do I want to move this to be an international specification? Does it make sense as an international specification? Am I going to put in that effort? Who's going to sponsor that? What is the driver going to be to try to get more countries using this thing? And then finally, whenever we're talking about internationalization, language comes into play. Not all countries in the world speak English. Not even my country speaks entirely English. And so injecting alternative language representations into the specification may also become relevant. How to do that is a completely different tutorial or DevDays talk. And in fact, there was a session on it, I think a year ago. So go look up the YouTube presentation from Graham on, actually it might have been Renee on that, but that's also something to think about. So mostly on time. Hopefully now you are familiar with the terms of universal and realm specific and internationalizable and can think about where that fits in terms of the work that you're doing and the work that you see produced elsewhere. You have some sense of why US development is as prolific as it is, how to evaluate whether a US specification might be appropriate to internationalize and leverage in other countries, and have a sense of what the primary areas to look at in a specification are when you're evaluating whether to take that on for use elsewhere. Best place to find me is always chat.fire.org. I try to keep that clean every day, which is sometimes challenging. You can also reach me by email. Happy to talk further about this at any time. But for now, let's talk about it here. Questions, thoughts?
There is a comment online.
Okay.
As a middle ground to using two separate profiles, I believe it's possible to separate general constraints from local specific constraints in fire shorthand using a rule set. I'm not sure about the mechanics of another IG inheriting from this other than copy paste though.
I'm not aware that rule sets can define something as being realm specific versus not. You can certainly define multiple layers of profiles in shorthand and sort of have one set that defines your base profile and another set that defines the more refined US content. Is anybody else familiar with a shorthand capability that would let you define something as realm specific? I mean, Mark does all sorts of weird, wild, and wonderful things that I'm not totally caught up on yet. So if it's possible, cool and awesome. And I will have to chat with Mark at some point this week to find out. But it's not something that I can speak to.
Other questions?
Sure.
So US core is US core, but in the United States, a particular vendor may want to support multiple profiles and have them all on their server as the same endpoint. And so, I see the thing where it's, like maybe I need to support this because I'm supporting multiple countries, but maybe just in providing an API within a country, it could be an issue. Because that worries me right now. When I look at, let's say, my EHR vendor's API, I want to know how many profiles are they supporting on that API. I know they're supporting US core, but I think they might be supporting something else there too. Maybe prior auth.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal for FHIR is that you expose patient or allergy intolerance or observation or whatever in a way that complies with all of the profiles that consumers might need. So you would spit out your patient instance and it would proclaim the US race and ethnicity extensions for the patients that have that. And it would also expose the First Nation status of those that have that. And it would expose the address part of house split across the street from, or the various scripted name representations in Asian countries, or the Hijri date of birth in Saudi Arabia. And you just spit out all of these data elements, whatever happens to exist, and the data satisfies a profile or not. So if you spit out a Canadian patient, they're probably not going to have a US race and ethnicity present because it wasn't captured for them. And if you spit out a US patient, it's probably not going to have a Hijri date of birth present, but your software is capable of sharing all of the data that it happens to have, and it can choose to enforce constraints on inbound data based on the source of the data and presumptions about what set of rules it needs to comply with, if any. So if you're consuming an international patient data feed, you probably can't require that US realm and ethnicity are present. If you're consuming a US specific data feed, then perhaps you can. Did that help?
Yeah, and sometimes it could be an international.
Most,
It could be also international and US realm combined.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not going to be uncommon at all to have a system that's capable of spitting out data that complies with international patient access and also complies with US realm. And what that may mean is that in some cases, you're going to spit out two different codes from two different code systems because there's a requirement for CPT codes for certain things in the US, but a requirement for those same things to be coded using SNOMED in IPA or IPS. And so you will simply spit out both because your system has mappings between them and knows how to do that.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions online.
Okay.
If a domain has developed some clinical profiles that would have international application, what is a good way to share them?
The simple answer is stick it in an implementation guide registry, but that's not a great answer because all sorts of things get dumped into registries and we don't yet have a wonderful curation mechanism for people to look through that content and say, this is gold, this is somebody messing around, and I really don't want to touch that ever. It's a problem that we haven't solved well yet. And I'm looking at one of our new directors of the implementation. Actually, we have both. You're responsible for implementation. So it's something we need to do to find better ways of exposing content to people. Graham and one of the presentations this morning talked about the proliferation we have of implementation guides. And one of the reasons that implementation guides proliferate is people can't find what already exists and don't have easy ways to leverage what already exists and adapt it to their local use. So it's definitely something that we need to work on. In terms of other things that you can do, surface it on chat.fire.org because that's much more searchable. And if somebody searches there and finds a reference to your implementation guide, that will be helpful. And you can also just talk to the community there and encourage people to come look and play and use. And come to DevDays, highlight its existence at a forum like this. Is another good way of making people aware that, hey, here's some useful content. And it's much more likely that people will take it up if they're aware of it. Okay.
Are structure maps useful in this context?
Structure maps could be useful, but probably not that much. So structure map allows you to transform one instance into another instance. And when you're looking at moving things from one country to another country, what you're typically wanting to do is add some stuff that wasn't there. And most cases, a transform isn't going to do that for you. You have to change the underlying system to have the data. So if I've got a Canadian system and I want to market it in the US, structure map is not going to cause, for example, US race and ethnicity to magically show up when it wasn't there previously. In some cases, structure map combined with concept map can handle the injection of additional code translations. So if I'm already spitting out, say, RX norm, and I want to now start spitting out Canadian CCDD codes, and there's a structure map that has that, or sorry, a concept map that has that, then a structure map could say, go and look up this translation and inject that into the instance.
Thank you, Lloyd. I think we're out of time. Anyone has any questions from this group here?
All right, well, you can find me online or you can find me wandering around here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lloyd. Thanks everyone for your questions.